Do you loathe the idea of learning music theory? Does it sound boring and overly complex? Or maybe you're just looking for somebody to explain it in a way that you can actually understand and, most importantly, put it into action. So in this video, we're going to dive deep into the foundational concepts and must-know ideas about music theory so it can actually help you compose better music and work as a producer. Hey yo, it's Alex from My Music, and as always with this channel, it's my mission to help you, the musician, the producer, the artist, produce themselves by developing their mindset, expanding their creativity, and connecting to their inner artist in a deeper way. All right, so let's learn to read music, the staff, and memorize all the keys and scales in order. Not just kidding. I'm gonna actually cover some stuff that's gonna help you, so let's dive in. All right, so as a producer, you're most likely not going to have to learn how to read music, memorize the note names, memorize your sharps and flats, unless maybe you're a keyboardist, pianist, and I'm not putting any of those things down, but I don't think that they're foundational pieces of knowledge that are actually gonna help you right now. All right, so the goal of this video is to just give you what you need to understand to then be able to discover and utilize any concept you'll learn later in the easiest way possible. All right, so to start, I have push 2 loaded up here, and I have scalar loaded so you can see the piano version of everything we're talking about as well. And the way that I have the push laid out right now is that all of the lit up pads equate to the white keys on the keyboard. All right, so if I play through these white pads, you'll see me ascend up the white keys. Right? And then all of the dim pads are equivalent to the black keys on the piano. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about, the foundational building block of absolutely everything in music theory, is this idea of intervals. Okay, and intervals are simply the distance between two notes. And if you think about it this way, every single musical device, whether it's a scale, whether it's a chord, whether it's a chord progression, all of these ideas can be broken down into formulas and the intervals that make up whatever you're talking about. So if you know your intervals very well and you get a really intuitive connection with different intervals, how they sound, how they work together, you'll be able to create chord progressions, write chords, discover scales, learn scales super easily because you can just break them down into the building blocks of the intervals that make them up. And one powerful thing of approaching it this way is you don't necessarily have to know the note names for now, although I do encourage you to study the note names and get familiar with them. But you don't need to know the note names to build chords, to benefit from really cool sounds and discover new territory. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at is the major scale, okay? And the reason why the major scale is so important is because it is the foundational structure, it is the foundational building block for all sorts of chords, all sorts of different scales, including the minor scale. All right, you can actually modify the major scale with your knowledge of intervals to find all sorts of different things, okay? And that's why it's so important, and that's why we're going to start there. All right, so before we dive into all of our different interval types and the major scale, I just want to talk about a super common concept that you'll see all over the place. And this is the idea of half steps and whole steps. All right, so the basic idea behind this is that a half step is the distance of 1 between notes. All right, so from the C to the C sharp, that distance is a half step. All right, and conversely, going from C to D is the distance of a whole step, okay? And this is extremely important to know because a lot of formulas you might come across will tell you a pattern of like whole step, half step, whole step, half step, which is the major scale, stuff like that. So it's just something to be aware of. All right, but I don't typically approach formulas or learning stuff in terms of half steps. And the importance of this is that every interval type that we're going to talk about is made up of a specific distance, all right? So a specific set of half steps and whole steps added together to make that specific interval, right? And it can be very handy to know that certain intervals are a certain amount of steps, meaning half steps, right? So a perfect fifth, for example, is 7 steps, all right? That's a very common interval. We're gonna get into it in just a second, but this distance is 7 steps, right? If I count up from here, right? If I count up from this bottom note to this note, I have 7 half steps, right? 1, 2, 3, 7, right? So if you can start to memorize some of these intervals along with how many steps, how many half steps make them up, you'll just have a lot easier time internalizing that knowledge and making it second nature. All right, now with that out of the way, let's talk about intervals, interval qualities, and the major scale. All right, so if we play through this major scale, you'll have heard this undoubtedly many, many times before. Do, re, mi, that whole thing. And the power of the major scale, and any scale for that matter, is that every note in the scale has a specific interval to it, okay? And the power of this is that every single component of a scale, a chord, is made up of intervals, right? And that's why it's so powerful to learn these intervals, because it applies to so many different contexts. And it is kind of the building block of anything in music theory, right? So you can exercise that knowledge as far as you want and grow from there, but it's a great place to start. So one thing to know about intervals is they have both a quantity and a quality component to them. All right, so they have some sort of descriptive part of them, and they also have a number element to them. And any interval that you'll find will have these elements, and it's the combination of both the quality and the quantity that will describe every interval individually. All right, so if we look at our major scale, let's go ahead and start with the quantity part, okay, the number. All right, so if we start on our root, which are all the darker orange pads on the push 2, and the first note of any scale of any chord will be called the root, and you can also reference this as number 1, okay? So if we start on C, this is the root, this is number 1, interval 1, right? And if we climb up the scale, every single subsequent note, we can just add on a number, okay? So this is 1, this will be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then when you get to 8, you can say 1 again because it is the same note, okay? It is the octave. So anytime you play the same note higher or lower, that's what's called an octave, okay? So these are all the same note, just in different octaves. They're all Cs. All right, so now that we have a number attached to each of these scale degrees, and that's what we can call each of these different notes in a scale, is scale degrees. So this would be the first scale degree, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and then the octave. And the power of this is that we have now given a number to every note in this scale. And most scales that you'll see will be made of 7 notes. All right, so now let's focus on the quality of these intervals. All right, so aside from giving them a number, we can actually assign a quality to a bunch of these intervals to just define them further. And the power of this is that it gives a unique name to every single unique interval so that they all have a name. All right, so you're going to see 5 different qualities of intervals. All right, number 1 is the major interval. Number 2 is the minor interval. Number 3 is a perfect interval. Number 4 is a diminished interval. Number 5, an augmented interval. And for now, we're just going to worry about major and perfect, okay? All right, so if we think about our major scale, every single interval in it is either major or perfect, all right? And the way that intervals are kind of divided is that the second, the third, okay, so number 2, number 3 are either major or minor. Number 4, number 5 are either perfect, augmented, or diminished. And number 6 and number 7 are again either major or minor. All right, so let's kind of go through the major scale and name all these intervals knowing that they're all either major or perfect. Okay, so we have our root, which is our 1. So here's our 2. So if we think about what we were saying is that 2 and 3 are either major or minor, that will mean that this is a major second. Okay, so this interval, which is a whole step, is always called a major second, always. All right, that is the name that we give to this distance. All right, so let's continue. 1, 2, 3, this is the third note of our scale. And this distance from the root to this is what is called a major third. Okay, so far we have a root, major second, major third. One great concept to internalize is to attribute a specific distance with a name. So as we saw, this whole step is a major second. All right, so this measurement of distance from any given note is the distance of a major second. if we do the same thing to this major third, this distance from the root note to this major third is 2 whole steps. All right, so keep that in mind as we keep moving through these intervals. All right, so we have our root, major second, major third. Then we get to the 4th degree of our scale, number 4. All right, and this is where it changes. The 4th and 5th interval of a scale, a chord, of whatever you're talking about will have a different quality than major or minor. It's going to be either perfect, augmented, or diminished. However, keep in mind that augmented and diminished are a lot less common than perfect. All right, most of the time you'll be interfacing with perfect intervals. However, if you come across an augmented interval or diminished interval, you know that it's referencing either the 4th or the 5th interval in whatever you're talking about. All right, so let's continue. Root, major second, major third, and the 4th in a major scale is a perfect 4th. All right, so let's move up to the next interval. So we have our root, major second, major third, perfect 4th, perfect 5th. Okay, and again, we can start to remember these intervals by the distance that they have. So if we think of this perfect 4th, this is actually 2 whole steps and a half step. Okay, so this would be a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so your perfect 4th has 5 half steps. That distance is always a perfect 4th. If we move up to our perfect 5th, this distance is 7 half steps, right? If we count 7 all the way up, just like we did earlier, we're going to get that perfect 5th. Let's keep moving forward. So we have root, major second, major third, perfect 4th, perfect 5th. Now we get to the 6th degree of our scale, and the 6th degree is again either major or minor, but in the case of the major scale, this is major. So we have our major 6th here. This distance here is the interval of a major 6th, and it's 9 half steps. All right, so let's keep going. We have our root, major second, major third, perfect 4th, perfect 5th, major 6th, major 7th is the last interval in our scale before we get to the root. So this major 7th is again just a whole step higher than our major 6th. All right, so it's 11 half steps. It's 1 less than 12, right? Which is all of the notes, right? Once you go through 12 notes, you've gone through every possible note. You've gone through the chromatic scale. All right, so you might understand this, but you might ask yourself, like, well, how is this important? How can I use this in my music? And the powerful thing about this is that any single chord that you learn or any single scale that you learn will have a formula. All right, now that you understand that, you might ask yourself, like, how is this useful in my music? So let's actually build on this. So now that you know the intervals of the major scale, all right, we have our major second, our major third, perfect 4th, perfect 5th, major 6th, major 7th, and the octave, and you understand that each of these intervals have a specific measurement of distance from your root note, right? Right, these intervals all have their own unique sound. Well, the powerful thing about learning it from the major scale, all right, so if you look at our keyboard here, when we play through this C major scale, we're playing through all the white notes from C to C. And if you think about this distance, right, if we only have 12 notes to work with, this is the widest possible distance that we can have before the notes repeat, right? You can't have 13 notes because that's just the same thing as this note again, right? So we have 12 notes to work with, and the major scale is the widest set of intervals that you can have. All of the major or perfect intervals are the widest set of intervals that you can come across in going up the chromatic scale. Okay, so what I mean is that when we play through all these white notes in C major, is that there's no wider interval we can have. All we can have is shorter intervals. All right, this is the power of really understanding the intervals of your major scale and thinking about it as the widest possibility of intervals. And if you think about it that way, now if you shorten the distance of these intervals, we're going to actually find different intervals. And by doing this, by cross-referencing the major scale and tweaking specific intervals within that major scale, you can get absolutely anything else, right? Because absolutely everything in music theory can be broken down in reference to the major scale, and then just modifying that major scale to find the formula for whatever you're trying to play. All right, so let's actually talk about this a little bit. So if we look at this major scale, we know that we have major intervals or perfect intervals, right? Our 2, 3, 6, and 7 are majors, and then our 4 and 5 are perfects. All right, simple enough. But what happens if we decide to shorten some of these intervals, right? As you've probably noticed with the C major scale, we haven't actually played any of the black notes. So we're missing a bunch of intervals. And the best way to think about these other intervals is in relation to this major scale, because it'll help clarify it. All right, so let's go through and actually discover the other intervals that we have not talked about yet. All right, so let's start with our major second, right? We have our root, then we have our major second, which is the distance of a whole step, right? We skip over a note, that's a major second. Well, what happens if we flatten this interval? And that's something I want you to remember, is that anytime you take an interval and you shorten it by 1, you could also call that flattening an interval, okay? So for example, if this is C and this is D, you can flatten this interval and you're gonna get D flat, right? And that's a different sound. We definitely don't have that sound in our major scale, right? What is that interval? Well, that interval is actually what we call a minor second, okay? So whenever you have these major intervals and you flatten it down 1 note, you get the minor equivalent of that interval. So this is a major second, right? Because it's the second note from the root. But now if we do this, we have flattened this and we get a minor second, right? So minor is the quality of this interval. It's a specific sound. It's extremely dissonant. And the second means it's the second degree of our new scale of whatever you're working with if it has a minor second. All right, let's keep going. We can do the exact same thing to our major third. So our major third is this distance, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 half steps, 2 whole steps. There's your major third. Well, you can do the same thing. You can flatten this major third and we're gonna get a minor third. So listen to this sound, right? It's a different interval. It's a different distance. All right, so this distance from a root note is what is called a minor third. And just a fun fact, anytime you're working with a scale or chord or anything, if you have a minor third, it will be a minor, whatever it is you're talking about, a minor chord, a minor scale. If you have a major third, it will be a major scale or a major chord. That's just something to keep in mind, that the third degree, this minor third of this major third interval, is extremely important in defining whatever you're talking about as being major or, all right, so let's recap that. We have our major second, minor second. If you flatten it, you have your major third, minor third if you flatten it. Let's keep moving on to our perfect fourth. All right, well, we can't actually flatten this, because if we would flatten this, it would just become our major third again. All right, so let's actually move this up, because we haven't covered this note yet, right? And in this case, if you're moving something up in terms of the perfect fourth, it would be sharp. All right, so you're sharpening this perfect fourth because you're moving it up a note. So this could be a sharp 4, all right, which can also be called an augmented fourth. All right, and this is where things can get a little bit tricky. All right, if we move on to our perfect fifth now, we can actually lower the perfect fifth as well and get that same note. And in this case, we would call it a flattened fifth, right? Because we took this perfect fifth, we flattened it, and that flattened fifth would be a diminished fifth. So with these perfect intervals, right, with the 4 and the 5, if ever you're moving it up, you're augmenting that interval. And if ever you're moving it down, you're diminishing that interval. All right. And that's where you get augmented or diminished as new interval types. And the only reason that there's different names for the same thing, like if we play this interval in reference to augmenting the fourth, then it's an augmented fourth. But if we play this interval in reference to the perfect fifth, if we flatten this fifth, now we're playing a diminished fifth. And if in the context of whatever you're talking about, you're actually flattening that fifth or you're sharpening that 4, it will actually just make more sense in terms of naming conventions, although it's 2 names for the exact same interval, right? That's the tritone interval, which could be an augmented fourth. It could also be a diminished fifth, depending on the context. All right, so far we have our major second, major third, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, and then augmented fourth or diminished fifth. All right, let's keep moving. So now we have our major sixth interval. Again, It's the same thing. We can flatten this major sixth and get the minor sixth. All right, we haven't heard that interval before, right? And a great way to think about it is a minor sixth is just 1/2 step lower than a major sixth. You're just flattening that interval. Let's keep moving up. You can do the exact same thing with this major seventh. There's your major seventh. You can flatten this to a minor seventh by playing the note 1 lower. So the power of that is that we've actually named the distance of every single interval that you will find. There is no other intervals, although sometimes, I should mention, you will see intervals being named as 9s, as 11s, as 13s, but all that means is that you're playing this interval, but just an octave higher. So for example, if we're playing a 9, if you see a 9 somewhere, that would be your major second, but just an octave higher. You just add 7 to it, and then you get this 9 interval, right? Same with 11, just add 7 or subtract 7. If you see 11, we're talking about a 4, right? Which would be here. A 13 is a 5, so on and so forth. But there's no real difference between a major 9 and a major second other than just being an octave apart. All right, so that's one thing to keep in mind. But now with everything we've covered, you know every single interval that you'll find in music, at least in Western music. All right, so now knowing all these intervals, you might be asking yourself, okay, that's cool, but how can I actually use this in my music? How is this usable? And the powerful thing about this is if you can really memorize your intervals, or at least memorize your major scale intervals, you can find anything else from there. All right, that's the power of this. So if you intuitively know all of your intervals, like your major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, your octave, and you start to memorize the distance, like this is a whole step, this is 2 whole steps, this is a whole step and a half step, right? This is 5 half steps, 7 half steps, 9, right? 11 half steps, octave. If you can start to really memorize that stuff, now this is where the power comes, because if you go across the internet or you're interested in learning a certain chord progression, whatever it is, you can find it now. You can deconstruct it into its parts and you can reconstruct it with this knowledge. And that's why I think this is the most powerful place to start, right? So the power of this is, for example, if I give you a formula of like a major 7 chord is your root, your major third, your perfect fifth, your major seventh, you'll be like, oh, I actually know all that already. Here's my root, here's my major third, perfect fifth, major 7 chord. Beautiful. And if you're interested in learning how to play chords, I use the push too, but it's actually useful knowledge for deconstructing chords and finding your own voicings, finding inversions. I've created a whole other video going through how to construct chords like a pro, find your own voicings, inversions, all that great stuff. So if you're interested in checking that out, I'll link it in the card above. All right, so let's say you wanted to play like a minor scale instead of a major scale. Well, what if I told you the formula is basically just flatten the third, the sixth, and the seventh, and you got yourself a minor scale, right? Basically, what I'm saying is that your major third interval, this interval, is going to be a minor third. This major sixth interval is going to be a minor sixth, and this major seventh interval is going to be a minor seventh. All right, so if you just think of it that way, you find your major scale. Great. All right, so all you have to do is find your major scale, and let's flatten the third, flatten the sixth, flatten the 7, and we're going to get a minor scale. All right, so 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, octave. But instead of going through that whole process, I could just tell you it's a major scale, flat the 3, flat the 6, flat the 7, and you're there, right? Right, and that's the power of having this knowledge, because whatever it is, you can reference it to that major scale to discover it, to find it. And then if you really want to memorize it, you can memorize what that actual scale or what that chord is. So I hope you can start to see the power of this, the power of being able to construct a major scale and then break it apart into its intervals and then shift any interval that you need to find a scale, to find a chord, and break things down. And the more you practice doing this, again, the more it'll become intuitive, the more it'll become second nature, and you'll be able to find chord formulas, create chord progressions, all these cool things really quickly. And hey, if you're just getting started with music production and feeling completely overwhelmed by the process, or if you're having trouble finishing tracks, or hey, if you just want to get a glimpse inside my personal workflow, I've created a super easy to follow 7-step framework that helps you go from your very first ideas all the way to a finished arrangement, editing it, mixing, master, and get it past the finish line so you can get better and better the more times you cycle through it. It's super handy to have around the studio as a printout. So if you're interested in grabbing that, the link for it is in the description. And that wraps it up for this video. I didn't want to make it too long, but I really wanted to be thorough with my explanation of intervals and the concept of finding that major scale, modifying it to find anything else that you want to learn. All right, so if you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. If you want to stay in tune for the next MetaMind Music transmission, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And hey, let me know, was this useful for you? Did you learn something? Do you think this will help you kind of utilize some music theory to understand what you're doing a little bit better? Let me know in the comments down below. And until the next video, we'll see you later.